In 1969, the U.S. Congress passed the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, in response to increasing concern about the environment. This act requires assessing environmental impacts for all major federal actions, including all federally funded and/or federally permitted highway and transportation projects that the Federal Highway Administration, or FHWA, and other federal transportation agencies administer. A federal action can be federal funding, a federal permit, federal approval, or other federal activities required for a project. Requests for environmental services, or RESs, can either have federal funding through the Federal Highway Administration or submitted for a state-funded project. MoDOT environmental staff administers the NEPA process and oversees the NEPA reviews for all projects. NEPA consists of 3 types of environmental classifications: categorical exclusion, environmental assessment, and environmental impact statement. A categorical exclusion 2, or CE2, has environmental impacts that are between a categorical exclusion and an environmental assessment and requires written approval from FHWA. The programmatic agreement between FHWA and MoDOT for processing actions classified as categorical exclusion for federal aid highway projects defines the thresholds for a categorical exclusion and categorical exclusion 2. The majority of RESs are categorical exclusion classifications with a small number of CE2 classifications. An environmental assessment is completed when environmental impacts are uncertain or finds that there is no significant impact on the human and natural environment. An environmental impact statement is completed where the action is likely to cause significant impacts or significant impacts are known on the environment and result in a record of decision. MoDOT is responsible for preparing appropriate documentation to enable the expenditure of federal dollars and the issuance of federal permits for Missouri's proposed transportation projects. Design's Environmental and Historic Preservation section have staff specializing in the areas of historic preservation and cultural resources, community impact, wetland, streams and water quality, social and economic concerns, threatened and endangered species and their habitat, hazardous and solid waste, floodplains, parklands, agriculture, and air quality and noise. These specialists analyze the impacts that transportation projects will have with a level of analysis dependent on the scope of the project and its impacts as well as the type of environmental documents being prepared. The Request for Environmental Services, or RES, provides the Design Division staff the necessary information to obtain approvals and clearances from the Federal Highway Administration and the resource agencies, ensuring project compliance with state and federal regulations, thus preventing project delays. NEPA is a procedural law that regulates an agency's decision-making process and not the final decision. As recipients of federal funds, the district must first disclose any environmental consequences and evaluate alternatives that would avoid or lessen a project's impact before proceeding with final design, right-of-way acquisition, and construction. The Federal Highway Administration's policy is that the NEPA decision-making process be open and collaborative, with full disclosure of the steps taken. Therefore, documentation, government agency coordination, and public involvement are essential elements of NEPA. The Federal Highway Administration is the final authority when determining NEPA compliance, and MoDOT ensures that NEPA compliance is documented. It is essential MoDOT environmental staff are engaged early and throughout a project's development. An RES is submitted by the MoDOT district for its consultant on the MoDOT Environmental Services website. In general, an RES will be submitted at the location conceptual, preliminary plans, right-of-way, and final design stages of the project. However, not all projects will require that an RES be submitted for all 4 stages. The RES documents the project's resource impacts, and the Environmental Services website tracks the RES documentation. Instructions for using the Environmental Services website are provided in the Instructions link at the top of the Environmental Services webpage. For the submission of each project development milestone, there is a set list of materials that the district will need to provide on the RES to ensure that MoDOT environmental staff are able to assess potential impacts to each resource category. In general, it is helpful to provide a location or county map, a topographic map that includes the project limits, plan sheets that show any alternatives, a KMZ of the project, and the bridge memo if applicable. Many projects will require RES submittals at all major milestones or at least annually. An RES must be submitted at the location conceptual stage for every project. This typically occurs when the project is added to the scoping section of the Statewide Transportation and Improvement Program, or STIP. This allows staff time to schedule and prioritize the work identified in the desktop review and determine if the project may take longer to clear than others. The Preliminary Plans RES is the most important RES submittal for environmental and historic preservation staff. Typically, the preliminary plan submittal is when there is enough design information to complete a large portion of the field work for permitting or clearances. Some projects involve activities that cause very little disruption to the natural and human environment, if any. These projects will typically only require 2 RES submittals. An RES must be submitted at the Location Conceptual Plans stage, or Preliminary Plans stage, and then again at Final Design Plans stage, at least 60 days before the plans, specifications, and estimates, or PS&E, due date. The project manager will receive a notification 60 days before PS&E due date if a final design stage RES has not been submitted. It is important to note that when changes to a project occur, do not wait to send those with the new RES stage. Update the current RES or ask the Environmental Historic Preservation staff to edit the RES. A consultant must first register to use the RES system. MoDOT staff use their MoDOT login. Sponsors and consultants can choose individuals to list as project contacts in the RES system. The RES system provides automatic email notifications to these contacts when the sponsor or consultant submits the RES to MoDOT, when MoDOT reviews environmental resource sections, when permits, clearances, and attachments are uploaded to the RES, and when MoDOT environmentally clears a project. Every MoDOT project requires the submission of an RES form for each project milestone, which is part of MoDOT's online system for tracking and documenting NEPA for MoDOT projects. The RES is used for all MoDOT projects and all Nepa classifications. The RES form allows the district or consultant to provide any known environmental concerns or sensitive areas to make MoDOT environmental staff aware. When the district or consultant initially submits an RES, it should include, at a minimum, a project location map and project plans if they are applicable to a project or when they become available. Once the RES is submitted by the district or consultant, MoDOT environmental staff receives an email notification which begins MoDOT's 30-day review and response period. This 30-day turnaround time could be affected by the completeness of the submitted RES, staff workload, and changing priorities. MoDOT environmental staff assesses project impacts for each environmental resource section and provides instructions on how to proceed. Once the RES has been reviewed, the submitter will receive notification that it is complete. The submitter should then review the responses in each section of the RES to determine if additional information is needed by environmental and historic preservation staff. As permits and clearances are received, MoDOT environmental specialists will upload these to the RES for MoDOT review. MoDOT environmental specialists clear each environmental resource section, assigns a Nepa classification, provides right-of-way permission, and ultimately clears the project. Nepa classification is required prior to receiving an A date. To receive Nepa classification, the RES resource sections for cultural resources, threatened and endangered species, Section 4F, 6F, and noise must be cleared by MoDOT environmental staff. Public involvement must also be completed. All environmental clearances are required prior to bid advertisement. The district should request that MoDOT environmental staff re-evaluate the RES if there are proposed design changes, changes in project limits, or changes in environmental impacts. Contact MoDOT environmental staff if a re-evaluation is necessary or if you're unsure if a re-evaluation is needed. MoDOT Environmental will assist in determining which resources may require further evaluation and the process and documentation needed for re-evaluation. Good public involvement begins with engaging the public early and throughout the project. Identify stakeholders, including supporters and opponents. These may include residents, businesses, government, schools, churches, law enforcement, emergency responders, civic groups, and nonprofits. Build excitement for the project and be open to ideas from the public. Let the public know you hear them and considered their comments and concerns. Determine the best method for outreach and obtaining public input. This may include public meetings, press releases, social media, flyers, or a project website. Consider local issues that may limit attendance. Virtual meetings may also be needed. Public comment periods are typically 2 weeks to 30 days and may include comments received via email, online comment forums, or regular mail. Document the public involvement process through public notice, a project website link, displays, written public comments, and district resources. Take steps to incorporate any concerns or needs from the public into the project. Be sure to provide all public involvement information that has either already been conducted or will be conducted within the RES system. All substantive public comments need to be responded to by the district, and each district response needs to be documented and provided to the environmental specialist. There are many resources to help districts develop the RES documentation. The primary information source is MoDOT's Environmental Policy Guide, or EPG, which includes the EPG section 127.1 for environmental and cultural requirements. This EPG environmental and cultural section has information needed to describe the RES resource categories. Within the RES system are instructions that describe how to use the RES system and the information needed. A link to the instructions is included at the top of the RES system page. The primary stakeholders in the RES process are the Federal Highway Administration, MoDOT, and often a consultant. The Federal Highway Administration approves, verifies, and oversees NEPA compliance, while MoDOT environmental staff administers the NEPA process and oversees the NEPA reviews for all MoDOT projects. The district receives Federal Highway Administration funding for its transportation project and is required to provide the necessary resource information to evaluate environmental and cultural impacts. An RES should be submitted as soon as possible when the project is added to the STIP or scoping part of the STIP. Delays can occur for a variety of reasons and often cannot be anticipated until RES resource information is provided. Common constraints to NEPA approval and right-of-way permissions include threatened and endangered species, cultural resources, public lands, and public involvement. Coordination with outside agencies including U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, MDNR SHPO, and Missouri State Parks can increase the timeline. Submitting the RES early can save time and money by allowing MoDOT environmental specialists to provide input on project constraints. Providing accurate information early in the process can minimize potential delays and allow for early agency coordination. The Request for Environmental Services, or RES, contains 13 resource categories and the Nepa Classification section. Each of the 13 resource categories must be reviewed and cleared by MoDOT environmental and historic preservation staff. For a description of each regulatory requirement and required information, click on the resource category.